Hey, good morning, church. Happy Tuesday to you. Pastor Matthew here. We're nearing the end of our series on the book of Ruth, and you'll remember that the book of Ruth is a story about suffering, and it's a story for anyone who's trying to reconcile the love of God with the brokenness of this world. Last time in chapter 3, we saw that God used both Naomi and Boaz to answer their own prayers for Ruth, and we ended with the promise from Boaz that he was going to try to function as a redeemer for Ruth. Now, to understand what's going on here, we need to review the concept of redeemer in the Old Testament. One of the things that a redeemer would do is a redeemer would make sure that his relative's name continued generation after generation. And what I mean by that is there would come a situation sometimes like the one that we saw at the very beginning of the book of Ruth, where a man, a husband, would die without having any children. That's been the case for Ruth. Her husband, Naomi's son, died without them having any children, and so there's a risk that his name would die out. His family line would end at that point. To prevent that from happening, a redeemer had the responsibility of coming in and going with that widow and bearing a child to continue the line of that man. Now, this came with a cost to that redeemer because that child would not bear his name. The child would bear the name of the deceased man. And in the Old Testament, of course, family line's very important, name's very important, and so it's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice to invest in a child that's not going to bear your name. It's not going to bring you any honor. That's why we see in another place in the Old Testament a redeemer trying to get out of his responsibilities. And we see it here as well at the beginning of chapter 4. We were told at the end of chapter 3 in verse 12, Boaz says, there's a redeemer closer than me, which means there's a relative who's more closely related to you, and it's his responsibility first to be the redeemer. He's going to have to abdicate that responsibility for Boaz to be able to step in. And that's where we come in chapter 4, when we're told that Boaz redeems Ruth. He takes this decisive action. He goes to the gates of the city to meet the closer redeemer, and then there's this great character contrast between the two of them. Boaz is willing to redeem Ruth, and he offers the opportunity to this closer redeemer who seems very excited until verse 5, when he finds out that Naomi and Ruth are going to come along with this agreement. And at that point, he says he can't do it. He says, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. In other words, I'm not willing to make the investment that I'm not going to see the payoff for. If I buy this land back, perhaps the land had been given to a tenant. We're not sure exactly, but somehow it's going to involve a financial transaction. If I receive the land back that belonged to this man and I take on this widow, I'm going to end up probably giving this land back to the son of the widow. And so I'm going to make an investment, and it's not going to be profitable for me. And so he forfeits his responsibility here. He abdicates. Of course, there's a ironic punishment for him here. One of the reasons someone wouldn't do this is it would threaten their name. Well, in the Old Testament, the punishment fits the crime, and this man remains nameless in the book. So Boaz, who's willing to help another man's name, he continues, and he's now famous. And this man who refuses to raise up the name of the dead is nameless. And so there's an implicit judgment there from the narrator on his actions. What we see here, the point though, is this: when we allow God to use us in suffering, we make great sacrifices. When we allow God to use us in suffering, we make great sacrifices. Boaz here is making a sacrifice on behalf of those who are less fortunate. Now, for us, it could look like a financial sacrifice. Maybe it looks like a sacrifice of time as we sit with people who are grieving. Maybe it looks like a sacrifice of our life as we commit to walk with people over a long period of time through difficult situations. Whatever it is, there's not an immediate, clear reward when we walk with God. It will cost us something. And so this character contrast highlights the way of the righteous man, the way of Boaz, versus the way of the man who shirks his responsibility. Some people are only interested in God's power and his people when they have something immediate to get out of it. And yet what God calls us to is something richer and much deeper, which is to be with people through thick and thin. Of course, God uses this to bring redemption in verse 17. We're following up here. Ruth and Boaz marry, and they have a son. They call this son Obed. And in verse 17, the women of the neighborhood say a son has been born to Naomi. Well, of course, we know this isn't true, right? It's Ruth's son, not Naomi's son. And yet they're making a point here that Naomi, who told us earlier to call her bitter rather than sweet, to call her Mara rather than Naomi, has not gone, as she claimed, from full to empty, but now she's gone from empty to full. God uses Boaz's actions to restore. Of course, that restoration isn't full, right? The dead are not raised. Naomi is still a widow, and Ruth has still lost her first husband. And so while God brings redemption here, it's not full and final. He doesn't bring a complete end to suffering. We'll talk about that a little bit more next time. And so it causes us to look forward to the time when suffering will be brought to an end, and that's what we look forward to in Jesus. He is an even greater Redeemer, and he's the one who's going to finally and fully end suffering for us. He does that in his victory over death, which he accomplished when he sacrificed himself for us, and because he was sinless, death could not have a hold on him. And so that's what we talked about a few weeks ago in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul taunts death. Death, where's your victory? Where's your sting? We'll see next week that Ruth and Boaz play a critical role, or not next week, but next time, the end of chapter 4, that Ruth and Boaz play a critical role in that part of God's plan in bringing Jesus to us. Until then, thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.